right, so good morning and good afternoon, wherever you are located in the world. My name is Jessica Tillotman, and I am the Assistant Dean for Government Procurement Law Studies at the George Washington University Law School in Washington, D.C. I am delighted to invite you or to welcome you to our program today on tech fixes for procurement problems. I am thrilled to announce that we have almost 380 registrants for this program from 59 different countries, which is pretty impressive. So you are joining us from all over the world, literally. The program will address today both the potential and the challenges associated with the use of digital technologies in government procurement. The focus of today's program will be a presentation led by Professor Albert Sanchez-Graels, who is a professor of economic law and co-director of the Center for Global Law and Innovation at the University of Bristol Law School. The focus of his presentation will be based on the initial findings of his ongoing research funded by the British Academy. He will tell you more about that research and his findings to date. We are also then going to be joined by my colleagues, both Shope and Eliza. Their bios are available on the website where you registered. And I'll put a link to it again if you'd like to read more about them so that we don't waste time on this important discussion with bios. On the website, we will be leading a discussion of the research and the presentation that Albert provides during this time. At the end of the session, we will leave plenty of time for you to ask questions. We welcome those questions. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window for any questions that you have. We may also respond to some things in the real time in the chat, but nevertheless, we'd like this to be a robust and a robust discussion with all of you. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Albert. Albert, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Jessica, for organizing and hosting this presentation, and to you, Eliza and Shobi, for the insights that you're going to provide on my research. As Jessica said, I'm delighted to be here to be able to present some preliminary findings of a project that I'm carrying out. This is a year-long project that the British Academy has kindly funded by basically giving me research time, which these days in higher education is like dust gold. And I decided to concentrate on the interaction between digital technologies and procurement. And in particular, I take a governance perspective into this interaction. And I want to look at two different things, but they're different, but they're interrelated, which is how do we use procurement to buy the technologies, and how we use procurement to impose specific safeguards, or maybe how we are failing to impose those safeguards in how technologies are being adopted by the public sector. But then also to look at how this is specifically happening in the area of procurement, so how we are digitalizing procurement. And as I'm always a bit chaotic, I started working on this second part first. So the goal today is to concentrate specifically on the area of procurement digitalization. So we're not going to be looking at buying technology, although of course, if it emerges in the Q&A, we can address it. We're going to be looking at the broad phenomenon of procurement digitalization, starting with what I have termed the policy irresistibility of tech. So why is all of a sudden this at the top of the reform agendas almost anywhere in the world, and in whichever of the 59 countries you're joining us from, I'm sure this is a hot topic. And my claim is going to be basically that this is very irresistible because it's not well understood. So what I'm going to try to do is explain what is my understanding of what the technology can actually do once you take a good look at it. And more importantly, what are the enablers that have to be put in place and that are usually roadblocks towards digitalization, in particular, data and digital skills. And finally, I'm going to have some reflections on whether we have to regulate this risk-taking in the process of digitalization and this exposure to technology. So this is the agenda for the next 20, 25 minutes. And I will try to be a little bit provocative to keep your attention, but also to give Jessica, Eliza, and Shopi things to jump on a bit later. So the first thing is, I've termed this a little bit provocatively policy resistibility. And I think it comes from the observation that all of a sudden we see very clear hype cycles in talking about procurement digitalization. And in some jurisdictions, it's surprising that electronic procurement is not yet fully embedded. And we're already trying to do the next thing. So this got me thinking about why this is the case. And I tried to take a step back, and I realized that at core, procurement is really an information-based activity. So the public buyer has a need, and they need to find out who can supply this need with which specific solutions, products, or services. It needs to find out lots of information increasingly on how resilient the supply chain is, how compliant with all sorts of requirements on human rights, modern slavery, and integrity, and so on. So procurement is really an information activity that is affected by both the intensity of this information. So there's loads of information that has to be managed, but also by the increasing complexity of this information. And then, not by chance, digital technologies are really suited to that. So all of the technologies we're going to be discussing today are technologies that are data intensive, that can basically crunch through massive amounts of big data to either classify information or make predictions. And that is what is making them at first sight or at first value potentially very attractive, very applicable in procurement, as they are also in other aspects of public sector activity. However, it's not only this theoretical fit that is driving the interest and the hype. It's also that the public sector has a massive shortage in digital skills. And that lack of capability to understand the technologies, to get ahead of the new technological trends, puts the public sector in a bit of a passive receiving position, where the private companies and maybe some policy entrepreneurs within the public sector, the more techie civil servants, if you want, have a window of opportunity to basically push agendas towards the adoption of specific technologies that make this quite irresistible. Irresistible both in terms of the attractiveness, but also in a lack of effective checks and balances or pushbacks against this sort of technological optimism, if you want. And my observation, looking at the reports that have emerged, like the Deloitte report for the European Commission, a 2021 report for the World Bank about what technologies are being experimented with, is that there is a bit too much experimentation in the sense of not having done proper groundwork in saying, is the technology fit for a specific problem? Do we have the right institutional and data environment to try to deploy the technology? But rather just jumping into, let's try what happens. Let's put it on a blockchain, see if it works. And I think that's problematic, basically for well, many reasons, but my main two would be, first, that it detracts resources from somewhere else, because it's not like the procurement budgets are growing. So we're putting money into this digitalization that we could be putting somewhere else. But the second one is that it does create a graveyard spiral of pilots that can be very problematic going forward. Because once one institution has tried 2 or 3 projects that didn't go past the pilot, it's going to be very difficult to convince anyone to try the 4th time. So I think we are in a moment where it's necessary to reflect and to understand well, from a whole life cycle governance perspective, what digitalization is about, what we can achieve, what challenges it brings. So that's what I'm going to start trying to do in the next slides. The first thing then is to say, if we have this issue of potential irresistibility of the tech, we are sort of blinded by new shiny things that are dangled in front of our eyes by consultants. The first thing we need to do is to try to really understand these technologies. And of course, there are loads of technologies we could be discussing, but I'm going to concentrate on three sets of them, which I think are the ones that have more potential in once all things are considered. The first one is robotic process automation, which I'm just going to refer to as RPA. I'll talk about them when I get to each of them. Second one is machine learning, which is a subset of artificial intelligence. But what I will say about machine learning is basically applicable to AI more broadly. And the last one, which is a bit of a strange mix, is about blockchain, smart contracts, and Internet of Things. And I would just like to clarify from now, if nothing else, because my friend Pedro Telles has already scolded me about it quite a few times, smart contracts can exist without a blockchain. And that was clear, for example, in the English Law Commission paper on smart contracts. But I will talk here only about smart contracts on distributed ledger technology. So anything else that is automatic software that makes things happen, I'm going to address as if it was an RPA process, right? So that's the way I conceptualize them. I know that Eliza might have something to say about this later on. So that's the first cliffhanger. Looking at RPA in itself, basically what RPA is a substitution of a manual process with an automated process with more or less sophisticated software. So something as simple as a basic process of, if you want to check which is the national insurance number of an employee, you need to open this database, put their surname in, and then you get the number. Instead of having someone do it with these 3 steps, you write a software that automatically does that. That's the sort of thing I'm thinking about in RPA, but it could also be something such as if you approve an invoice, then instead of having to tell somebody in finance to please pay, then it can get automatically paid. So basically, it's any process that substitutes a manual communication or a manual check with an automation. And the difficulty here with the procurement process is that not all parts of the procurement process are capable of coding, which is what automation requires. You have to translate this activity into exactly to the last detail, a code of what the machine should do instead of a human. And there are 2 aspects that make it difficult. It's not only about how hard it can be to map the entire process, which I think can be done with a lot of work and attention, but it's just that in procurement, we usually play with things such as the exercise of discretion. We play with things such as open-ended criteria that are difficult to define or that have some qualitative aspects to them. And that's something that can simply not be coded, which means that there is an unavoidable trade-off between automating and creating rigidity. And therefore, if we don't want to impose excessive rigidity, there's things we might not be able to automate. And that's the first thing that is not always obvious to everyone that looks at automation. You can only really automate things that are very clear, pass-fail, yes-no tests, or if-then sequences of actions. Everything else that is fuzzy, debatable, or dependent on an assessment of something that is not purely numerical cannot be done. So that's the first constraint on RPA. The second technology is machine learning, and machine learning, for short, is just a technology that uses algorithms, more or less sophisticated algorithms that get trained on masses of big data, and then they learn to do very specific, narrow things. And as I mentioned before, they can either classify or cluster or create predictions. So for example, a machine learning algorithm can be used for weather models that decide whether it's going to be -5 or -3 today in Bristol as a forecast. That's what they can, what's the sort of thing they can do. Or they can classify and they can say, well, given a very big amount of data, for example, if you want to create 3 categories of suppliers, say high-end, low-end, medium-end, then you don't know exactly where the boundaries are. The algorithm can find it for you. They can create clusters or classify. And this sometimes can look a little bit like magic, but really what they're doing is they just find patterns in the data, which means that machine learning is only as good as the data it runs on. That's the first thing that is very important. The second thing is that the theory of what the technology can do then needs to be put through the sift of the regulation of procurement. And that's when we start having more problems to try to understand what the true potential in procurement is. Because, for example, we all, knowingly or not, interact with, for example, recommender systems. When you are watching something on your favorite platform, and it says you might like this, or if you like this, then you will like that, or people like you like this other thing, that's a recommender system. And you could think, well, if I'm a public buyer, I'm a small municipality, I need to buy chairs for my school, maybe it's useful for me to know which chairs all the schools in my region, all the schools or other municipalities of my same profile have been buying. The problem is that would go quite fundamentally against administrative law requirements in many jurisdictions, that you have to make your own decision. You cannot rely on somebody else's decision when you're procuring. So that basically takes out what is called collective filtering, which is this way of determining it. Most people like it, so you might like it too, sort of an Amazon or Netflix recommender. The alternative would be a recommender that is based on content analysis. So there have been, for example, some attempts by some Spanish researchers to create a recommender system saying, if you're a contracting authority located in the specific place, you want to buy something under this specific CPB code, then run the algorithm and it's going to tell you potential suppliers, like top 5, top 10 potential suppliers in your area. Now, the difficulty with that is that first, it's very hard to have a database that allows you to have information of all of the suppliers. But also in procurement, we always have to be open to the next entrant. We always have to be open to somebody that was not interested in theory on the contract, or somebody is entering the market, somebody that can tweak their provision so they can start doing this. So we could not use it as a matter of running the procurement. You could maybe use it to inform your decisions. But so what we start seeing here is that even where the technology allows for some specific things, legal constraints can limit it. And as far as I see, that's particularly relevant in machine learning, because you will have loads of difficulties in simply lifting what the private sector is doing with machine learning and transposing it to the public procurement setting. And another example I've been thinking about is chatbots. Of course, if you chat with your phone and ask Alexa to do this or that, then first, it's not a big deal if they don't get it right, they can do it again. But second, they have access to the internet, right? So these chatbots seem to, again, be like little sorcerers because they have unlimited access to what's on the internet. You could not develop a chatbot for procurement that was connected to the internet, because as a contracting authority, you hold liability for the information you provide. You need to make sure it's accurate, it's relevant to the specific tender, and so on and so forth. So the chatbot that you could develop and implement legally here would be one that is basically like an advanced frequently asked questions chatbot, which means you would have to have pre-addressed all questions you could think about, so that the chatbot has access to the right answers. And of course, that looks a lot like an expert system, and it immediately gets quite constrained. You might want to go through that effort, say, on general aspects of the procurement system, on general aspects of the rules or policies, but you would not develop loads of frequently asked questions for each specific tender that are different to that tender. So again, the chatbot is a bit limited because it sort of only cuts through so deep in the sort of information exchange that has to happen in a procurement exercise. Similar things happen if you try to use machine learning for automated screens or red flags. So there's lots of work going on in developing red flags for corruption or red flags for anti-competitive behavior. But the difficulty here is, again, that the data might be difficult to get, especially, for example, for corruption. You need loads of non-procurement information. You need beneficial ownership information, you need corporate assets, tax information, and so on. And it's difficult to get all that data to work. But even if you get it, then you quite quickly can hit due process issues, right? So if somebody is flagged as potentially corrupt, they will want to know, why is it that you're investigating me? And if you cannot say exactly why, you can simply say, oh, the algorithm sort of flagged you. I'm so sorry, I need to look into your business. Then probably that's not going to cut any legal master. So that also excludes some of the more powerful algorithms. And what I think we can do is fundamentally just automate. So what I call intermediate level red flags is just try to do more of the checks that a human could make, but maybe doesn't have the time or the cognitive abilities to do so. And a last one that I haven't covered yet in my research, but has come up recently as a result of this GPT chat launch, which you may have heard about, or maybe you have even told your GPT chat to write a poem about procurement, which apparently is a popular activity to do on Twitter. There are now lots of concerns that these big natural language processing models, and that's a form of machine learning, are really reducing the cost of writing text. So it might be very easy for companies that usually don't have the time to invest in a specific tender to just do it through one of these solutions, saying, write me a tender for the sale of this thing to this buyer and just put it in. So all of a sudden, public buyers can get completely flooded with not very good tenders that they still have to assess. And of course, then the question is, can I put an algorithm to do that? So can I have a sort of a bot-on-bot tendering system, a little bit like happens in trading and in other areas? And this is something I still need to think a bit more about it. But I think, again, because of legal duties, it might be very difficult to have an algorithm screen for spurious or non-serious tenders, because you have a duty once you reject or not consider tender to justify that. And again, it might be a bit complicated to do. So what I think we see in machine learning, data issues aside, which are fundamental, is that there's also loads of regulatory constraints that limit the true legal potential of this technology, however much consultants want to sell it otherwise. And then the last set, it's a different set of technologies. It's mainly blockchain or more generally distributed ledger technologies. This was very popular. We were talking at the pre-session with the other panelists. This was very popular maybe before the pandemic, and maybe 2 years ago. It has faded out a little bit. But I think it's still worth making the point that blockchains are not, or distributed ledger technologies are not a thing for procurement, because procurement will never be decentralized. So once you look at these technologies, what you see is that their beauty, if there's any to be found, is in that there is no single source of truth. So we don't rely on a source of authority to tell us this is the state of the ledger. For example, we don't rely on my bank to tell me how many pounds I have in my account today, but we just decentralize it. And by creating lots of copies of the ledger and making clear who can and how amend the ledger, we just basically create a ground truth without trust. That's the theory. But of course, it requires decentralization. And not in my wildest dreams, I would have thought a public buyer would be like, yeah, I don't want to have control over my department database, or I don't want to have control over my contracts database. Let's just have it completely spread out. And I think this has been demonstrated in these emerging reports on what technologies have been used. The blockchain, the very few blockchain technologies that were trialed at some point were blockchains with 1 or 2 nodes, both of whom would be owned by the same contracting authority. So they were fully centralized, or they would be highly permissioned. So you didn't get to see what was inside the blockchain. You didn't get to change what was inside the blockchain without the permission from the contracting authority or the entity that was running the blockchain for the public sector, which means that this is just a fancy database and one that is probably quite expensive and quite complicated to run. So I don't see it having loads of functionality as it is. And then people would say, well, the advantage of the blockchain is not in the blockchain itself, but isn't that you can add the layer of the smart contract. So once everything is on a blockchain, you completely automate and avoid discretion in everything you're doing. But there, again, the difficulty is that, and this has been said many times, smart contracts are not as smart, they are not contracts. They are software, they're pieces of software. And it's, again, very difficult to put in a smart contract a fully detailed instruction of what needs to happen, except for relatively simple transactions, right? So when I buy a song from the whatever provider of music you use, that could be a smart contract, right? So if user clicks here and credit card clears, give access to the digital right. This is something we can write pretty easily. But once you start thinking about procurement contracts, it's almost impossible. And the iterations that they try to create experimentally, that there's a famous paper by Harding and others from the Royal Holloway University in London. They said, oh, what we can run is smart contracts of up to 400 words. So what we need is procurement to stop being so verbose and all these lawyers to just be able to run a procurement in 400 words. Well, if anyone manages, please let me know and I'll give you my chair. And the final thing to say is that, of course, even if we manage to make it work, the distributed ledger technologies plus smart contract can only create digital effects. So the only thing they can do is write stuff on the ledger. But then if you need anything to translate into real world access or effects, then you need what's called an oracle. So you need to have some interaction between on-chain, off-chain. And these oracles are quite problematic from the perspective of the integrity of the procurement. If we were trying to use blockchain or smart contracts to avoid discretion or to avoid corruption issues, the only thing we're doing is moving them. Then the hot spot is in the oracle. Can I manipulate the oracle? Can I basically trump the oracle? So from a governance perspective, it's not greatly advantageous. Of course, it's going to have some applications in, say, the management of digital contracts or the management of things that can be put on a digital contract. So for example, a contract for heating, where you have smart meters everywhere, you could put it on an Internet of Things solution, saying, well, when that room gets cooler, then kick in the heating and then we start paying by consumption or things like this, but it's going to be quite marginal. So after a very lengthy sort of quick hike through the technologies, my conclusion is that we really have a feasibility boundary that is much more limited. So if you get somebody that is really, really excited about procurement digitalization and you get them to sit through my 15 minutes of gloom and doom, they probably realize like, well, this is not as cool as I thought, because what we can realistically do with the technologies and with the regulatory framework that we have is manage the intensity of the information we have in procurement. So we can automate some processes that are very information heavy. We can extract some insights from data if we have it that can be useful, but we cannot deal with complexity. Anything that is complex, anything that is fuzzy, technology is not really going to help us with that. And unless we are happy to go for a much more rigid, deterministic approach to how things are done, then that's out of the boundary. But the other one is that if you've been paying attention, you will have realized that everything depends on data, right? So I can only automate stuff that moves data around. I can only train machine learning if I have the data. I can only create an Internet of Things or any other solution if I have things that go through the data. And the reality of things is that for all the advances that we're having in open data, we're still really far away from having good quality, actionable open data on loads of things, procurement and procurement adjacent, that would allow for this. And in my view, this will remain the single biggest constraint for quite a while. Now, I have the inkling that things are not moving as much as they should, because we're not talking about procurement data. We always talk about open data. And I think that's where we hit a very significant wall, and I'll come back to that. But there is a clear interest in capturing and using absolutely every piece of procurement data we could possibly have to improve how procurement works. But the moment as a policymaker, the moment as a company, I need to start thinking about all the data being open or susceptible of publication, then that has a massive chilling effect. And this is an ongoing conversation I've been having with folks at the Open Contracting Partnership and others, and I'll come back to that point. But I think if we could decouple open from big procurement data, we would probably see a few more quick advances. But yeah, that's maybe the second cliffhanger I wanted to leave on the table. Now, we have already seen that this better understanding of the technology, if I got it right, is a little bit of a breather. Yeah, it makes the resistibility a bit more resistible. But the second thing is that we need to take into account that with these technologies come new governance risks and challenges. So of course, we still have risks of corruption, we still have risks of collusion, we still have risks of waste, and now those risks could be enhanced. So now there's going to be technology-supported corrupt strategies, technology-supported collusive strategies. So we need to deal with that. But even setting those aside for now, just creating the infrastructure for digital technology comes with new governance implications. And again, I have selected a few. There are new data challenges, not about getting the data, but about managing the data. There are new algorithmic and technological challenges. There are issues around technical debt, which is a word that I had not come across until I started this project, but I think I realized it's probably one of the most fundamental considerations that somebody wanting to digitalize has to take into account. If I have a 1980s infrastructure for my technology and I try to digitalize it, I'm basically locking myself into that infrastructure. And sometimes this is just done without thinking about it. And a few years down the line, we realize that the cost of keeping things going is too much, but we're also not willing to just let it all fall and start from scratch. So technical debt is very important. Algorithmic transparency is very important. We see it now, there is a global fight, so to speak, for the protection of algorithmic secrets, but procurement is emerging as an exception to that algorithmic secrecy. So there's quite a lot to be said about to what extent the public buyer that all of a sudden, for example, has access to source code is going to have a bit of a problem in trying to manage the secrecy of that source code, how they share it, and so on. There are also systemic challenges. Of course, the moment that you start creating open data publications with your APIs, so the application programming interfaces that allows downloads, once you start having everything put on the cloud, cybersecurity risks skyrocket. The more that you rely on those technologies, the more operational those risks are for your organization. So there's increasing regulation of cybersecurity is going to be very important. And then, of course, we go back to the beginning. You need digital skills, and there's a very big challenge in attracting and retaining digital skills in the public sector. I don't have time to go through the four of them in detail, so I've just chosen data and digital skills because I think they are more universal than the other ones that are a bit more regulatory in different jurisdictions, but I'm happy to go back to them in the discussion if that's of interest. So data challenges. The first one is about trying to capture the data. So the procurement process starts at the point where lots of data already exists. And the question is, how far back could we go to capture the data at source to make sure it's authentic, to make sure it's accurate? And then the second step is about how do we curate data? Again, that data curation is something that is usually below the radar. But I heard that, for example, some jurisdictions are developing price benchmarks. And what they do is that they take the historical of prices they've been paying for a specific item, and then they use an algorithm to say, is the price that you're getting for the next tender sort of okay with historical information? Well, in a context where, I don't know where you guys are sitting, but in the UK, we are lucky now that our inflation, instead of 11%, went down to 10.9% last month. Historical information is all of a sudden not really good. And you have to curate that. If you just keep running the algorithm as if inflation was 2 or 3%, which maybe was in most of your time series, you're getting very distorted insights. You might be getting very distorted decisions, for example, on what is an excessive price. So you need to start understanding a lot what is in the data, what needs to be cleaned or excluded. And then the final one, which again, I think is the real big sticking point, is data governance. So you're getting all of this data, you're storing it, but all of a sudden you have lots of obligations. And there's this push to proactively publish lots of information as open data. And that creates lots of obligations, creates obligations of complying with that, but also creates obligations of protecting information that should be confidential, that is subjected to rights of third parties, that may be contractually constrained. So even if you don't want to use technologies yourself, as a public buyer, just because you're a data holder and a data intermediary, you have all of a sudden loads of data governance obligations imposed on you. And sometimes the discussion is not going fully hand in hand. So in the European Union, just to give you an example, there's a big push now for open data through the new rules on electronic forms. So the Publications Office of the European Union is very keen on trying to get the member states to disclose as much data as possible. And only a couple of weeks ago, the Court of Justice went to say, sorry. A policy that puts everything out, except if it's a trade secret, is in breach of the EU procurement rule. So open by default, no go in the European Union. This is the Antea Polska case. If anyone is interested, we can discuss that. So what we see is that some of these challenges are also a bit of a moving target, and or the public buyer can be pulled in different directions, which makes it quite difficult to manage. Which takes me to the next point, which is that when you are having these tensions, and it's not only on data, it's on tech, it's on all the other aspects, cybersecurity, having limited public sector capability makes it more problematic, because you need to know to understand what you need to do. And if you're a public buyer with limited capability, the governance risk is that you have lots of unknown unknowns. So it's not that there are risks that we know are risks, there are known unknowns and we will have to manage them when they come up. It's just that you live basically in a state of ignorance. And that is really, really dangerous from a perspective of adequate public governance. To give you a sense of the scale, in the UK, there are 4,000 vacancies in the civil service for tech and data jobs. 4,000. So it's not that some departments don't have loads of data scientists. It's like we're trying to find them under the stones, and there are not those many to be had. Also because incidentally, the private sector pays a few multiple times what the public sector can pay. So this is a very big issue, and it is pushing further the hollowing out of the public sector. So what's happening is because we cannot find these in-house data scientists, we rely more on consultancies. And the more we rely on tech consultancies, the more we create a long-term erosion of our own capacity. There's no institutional learning, there's no institutional memory, but also we create more governance challenges. And maybe Jessica is going to be thrilled to talk a bit about organizational conflicts of interest in this context. But when you're big tech company that are sometimes advising, sometimes providing, and everybody's doing that, then all of a sudden you have a big problem in controlling all of these conflicts of interest on a sector-wide issue. And there's a very interesting paper by Canada's tech advisor. He created the term Charbonneau loops to define this, but it's basically when everybody's involved in all sides of the market, of course, we have a bit of a problem. So yes, this is not rocket science, right? You need a professor of law to tell you, if you want to use technology, you need to know what you're doing and you need some data to run it. But all of the legal analysis points that these are the primary issues that we need to sort out. And we're not going to sort them out legally, but we will have to sort them out somehow. And it's not maybe even an issue of throwing money at the problem, although that would be part of the solution. So going back to where we started, what we see is that there is all of this interest in digitalizing procurement. There are all of these issues with understanding the technology. There are all of these new governance challenges, but then the decision whether to digitize or not is largely unregulated. Right? So there's lots of policy push, digitize, but it's not clear how we need to go through the process of understanding, is this specific technology for this specific problem adequate? Do I have the enablers that I need? Is this sustainable with the capacity I have? How much is it going to cost, and so on? This is just a sort of free for all. And I think this is the case in the EU and the UK, but I would be surprised if any other jurisdiction is much more prescriptive, other than maybe Canada in automated decision making. But that's something we can discuss too. So there is some guidance. In the UK, there are guidelines on the procurement of AI. There is also guidance on the use of AI in the public sector. But all of this guidance is left to self-regulation. It's left to the provider self-assessing against no standards, whether they are trustworthy, whether they have data governance that is adequate. So what we have is a system where a public buyer that doesn't know much relies on what an interested private provider tells them about how the AI is going to work, or how the automation is going to work, and what are the implications of these things. This is what is called a second-party assurance mechanism. Again, second-party assurance mechanisms, not very good, because linking it back to my initial point, the contracting authority wants to digitalize. They are attracted irresistibly by the technology, so they're just going to buy whatever the private provider is going to tell them. And even if you have a bit more of a cynical buyer, they still don't have the capacity to really go to the provider and say, sorry, but what you said in the self-assessment really doesn't cut any ice. So in my view, we need to bring in an external third-party oversight mechanism. This is a proposal that I will develop in the second part of my research project, first part of the book. I will propose the creation of an AI in the public sector authority. And I was thrilled to see that the European Parliament has started discussing along the same lines the creation of an EU AI office in the context of the EU AI Act. So more on this in another seminar in May, if you can be tempted. Now, what are the policy implications I try to extract from all of these preliminary findings or thinking in the area? Well, I think if there is a country or a public buyer that really wants to facilitate procurement digitalization, there are quite a few things they need to do. Not necessarily in this order, but I think they need to do all of them. The first one is they need to really accelerate the implementation of a single state-of-the-art data standard, whether it's OCDS or OCDS compatible, but that is the absolute must. They also need to establish a very robust multi-tiered information management system. So it's not all open. We need to think very carefully about what is open, what is strictly closed or classified, and everything in between, and permission it properly, and so on. They need to really invest in boosting in-house digital capability, and they need to commit to reducing dependency on outsourced digital capability. Otherwise, this is not going to be sustainable in the long run. I think they need to establish a robust, and by robust, I mean almost adversarial process of technological scrutiny for any new tech project. Okay, so you want to automate this. Tell me exactly how you're going to do it. Tell me how this operates with your systems. What is the technical debt you may have or not? How are you going to repay it? And so on and so forth. And they also need to clarify the regulatory framework. It cannot be a sort of free-for-all, as we see in some jurisdictions. It can also not be just left to the private standard-setting organizations. Right now, the main regulator in AI is probably the International Standards Organization, which is accountable to nobody and controlled by private interests. Yes, and I'm on record saying that, so I can say it again. So that's why I think in this clarification of the framework, we need to create the external regulator is going to be the one saying whether the privately developed standard is good enough, and if not, what needs to actually be complied with so that we have proper digital tech governance. Now, I wouldn't expect you to have retained everything. So there's lots of resource and lots of detail of why I say the things I say. It's not purely my opinion. I spent a few hours reading stuff and writing. So you have it all through my blog. And this is my employer wanting me to promote. So this is all the stuff I've written some of the time, and you're welcome to see it. Thank you very much for your attention. I really look forward to the very interesting and pointy comments from Jessica, Shopee, and Eliza, and anything that comes from the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Albert. That was fascinating presentation. We do have a few questions that have come in the Q&A. The ones that I've indicated that I would answer live are the ones they're actually for Albert. But I want to actually give a chance to my colleagues to open up the discussion. So I don't know first if either Eliza or Shopee wants to start first. If you okay, Shopee's got the hand up, so let's go for it, Shopee.
Hi, thanks. I put up a human hand, not a digital one. Albert, while you were talking, one thing that struck me, well, two things struck me. I wanted to ask if in your research, if you have discovered that the the digital, the decision makers are not necessarily the public buyers, they're not necessarily the users. And is that a reason why we see a lot of experimentation and, projects that, that are not useful? Because I think from my experience, the people who make decisions as to what procurement needs from a digital perspective are not necessarily procurement people. They're not the users, they're not the contracting authorities. So I wanted to know what your experience is and whether you see that having an impact on some of the problems that we have, operational problems. And I think the second issue that I was thinking about when you're talking about the different risks, you didn't outrightly mention the risk of bias, which is one of the biggest challenges that AI systems are facing, or at least one of the biggest concerns that people have about AI system. So I wanted to ask what you thought about that, because I can easily see how some of the recommender systems or content analysis systems will obviously, entrench whatever biases we have in the underlying data. So those are the two things that I wanted to ask before my colleagues take over.
Thank you very much. Those are two very good questions. I think on the first question, I think you're spot on. So there's lots of projects on, let's try to digitalize procurement that are driven by finance department trying to create savings, or driven by a cross-government sort of digital unit saying now everybody uses this platform. And I think that's part of the problem. So probably one of the good practices in digital technology projects is to be very user-centric, and start very clearly from understanding the problem. I guess in some aspects, this is not very different from previous iterations of developing a software that doesn't work, that is not sort of supported by digital tech, or creating a process that doesn't really work for the user. So I don't think it's a specific digital governance risk, but it's a very big one. And I think the other issue is, of course, that even when you have the public buyer saying what they want, the other thing that I heard a bit more anecdotally is that when you buy digital technology, it's very difficult to go past the demo. Right, so you engage the external provider, they develop a demo that does what you want it to do, they go full scale, and the system doesn't do what the demo did. And what do you do? So I think that's another problem, that it's scalability, because sometimes what you want to do against a very tightly defined case study, so to speak, that's what the demo is going to look at, is different from the system operating in the wilderness of the bigger procurement process, if you want. So I don't know if that addresses your. And then on the second one, on the risk of bias, you're absolutely right. I mean, I didn't spend a lot of time talking about data quality, but that's one of the big issues with data quality. And on the recommender systems in particular, what you will have is a sort of first mover advantage. So the moment you get put in the recommender system, the more you get recommended. Sort of that. This is what's trending on Netflix. Now, why is everybody watching Christmas movies? I don't want to watch a Christmas movie, but that's what happened this week. So I think you're absolutely right to point that. And I think the other issue with risks or bias is that there's lots of other risks that are more difficult to see. So you could control for some of these things, like, oh, it's always telling me to hire the same company, so there must be something there, like first mover advantage. But there's things that are impossible to see in the recommendations. For example, it will not reduce barriers to access, even if you connect it to a bigger database, right? So that's another important point when we think about this, is that the technology will not fix broken systems. It will just automate them or magnify them. So that's an absolutely great point that you brought, and a good insight.
And it would actually lock in those problems in the system. It would make them permanent, because you then don't have the human oversight that can, think about what's going on. Yeah. Thank you.
I mean, thinking about areas where you're interested, like corruption. No? So one of the things they say is like, oh, AI can be very helpful in facilitating the detection of corruption. Maybe of the corruption we know what it looks like, but not of the corruption we don't know what it looks like. So it can actually entrench disguised forms of corruption that we've not been able to classify as corrupt for that. So there's lots sure. to be said there.
Thank you.
Albert, I just want to quickly, first, I think it's fascinating that we learned that Albert does not like Christmas movies. So that is a helpful data point for today's discussion. The second piece is, I found it interesting that your research focuses a lot on the concern about kind of commercial, the pushing of different products. And what we're finding in the United States, I'm sure that's an issue too, and one that I've not been primarily concerned with my own research. But what I find that we deal with, in addition to the multitude of other issues that you've hit upon, is the barriers just to get to the latest tech, that because of all the kind of blocks that have been put up to reduce corruption risks in the procurement system, it's very difficult for kind of innovative, kind of scrappy, nimble, flexible companies to come in and pitch some of these solutions to the government, because there's not a lot of ways. And there's been some attempts through, particularly in the Department of Defense, I think of like, TradeWinds AI, among otherwise, the Jake, to like reduce those barriers, and also the use of non-traditional contracting tools, like other transactions, to do this. Have you started to touch upon those aspects, or was more of your focus on the concern about commercialization kind of tainting the process?
So I've been mainly looking at commercialization and that risk of capture. That dimension that you're referring to, which is how do we get past the very shouty companies that try to sell us the technology to really identify what's good, is something I'm going to think about in the other part of the book, because it's about how do I do my market research so I know how to get them. What I found, for example, is I was a member of the jury of the European Procurement Innovation Awards that were given last week. And the winners are a Norwegian team that's called Start Off, that is a joint attempt by the Ministry of Finance and the procurement oversight body to facilitate precisely that. So what they've done is they created a system where they create challenges that startups can try to address, and then they fund them in a very quick escalation of minimum value products that they can then sell, and then they go to procurement. So I think what I'm starting to see is that the solutions to those barriers should not be, let's use a new procurement procedure, say in the European Union, the Innovation Partnership, or let's create more leeway for the purchasing of tech, because I think we are then exposing ourselves to corruption and all the reasons why those rules were in place. I think what you need to do is go at the earliest stage. It's like, how do I get these people trained in how to engage with the public sector? How do I support them financially so they can do it? I'm a little bit skeptical about creating a specific process to buy this tech. There's been discussion about this, for example, in cloud. So when everybody was trying to buy cloud, it's like, we cannot buy cloud possibly with the rules that we have, because they are too constringent. The standard terms and conditions and the service level agreements don't fit the procurement requirements. So lots of jurisdictions have tried to work around that. So like in the UK, the G-Cloud framework and so on. But once you look into it, I think sometimes it's a little bit of, again, hype. Like, well, why is this tech person not able to write a relatively straightforward proposal, right? And so I think everything we can do to simplify the administration of that is going to help. But I think we should support them outside of the procurement process. But what are your views?
Liza.
Thank you so much. I am very happy to see Albert taking the skeptical point of view for the technology potential for public procurement, because this is something that is always inspiring to find a solution, and finding a good challenge. This is something that we totally appreciate. But jokes aside, what is really important for us to look at, it is actually what you have put up front as why we digitalize procurement. Whether this is a hype, this is a tech fix, or it's a policy fashion that will go. And coming from where I am, so this is European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and legal team that is supporting structural reforms in the transition economies. We try to answer this question in front of every project. Do we start this project because it's a trend? AI is now fancy and we should be doing this. Or we have a very good reason to believe that digitalization of procurement is actually helping the country, helping the government, and helping the market. And here, I would like us all to make this recollection that we are in our life, we are going through the steps where things were first labeled electronic, then they were labeled online, then we were hearing them being digital, and then automation came, and finally we have artificial intelligence at the end of the sequence. And this is the experience which every government has to apply to their own market. And their market may be technically ready for the digital commerce, or they may not be. But the answer is, what is the future? Are we able to use technology to leapfrog and improve the governance of the countries where which are still struggling economically and in terms of development? And why we digitalize procurement overall? Because for me, I have absolutely no doubt that we are trying to digitalize procurement to handle two basic challenges procurement has. And this is a compliance challenge, because it is rule-heavy environment, which we know what these rules are for, because we do care about transparency, we do care about accountability, we do care about competition. But this compliance layer on a public contract with rules being developed is becoming more and more heavy, and transaction cost of procurement is growing. And can we afford this transaction cost in the transition economies? Most probably we can't. So digitalization, which is has a potential to make compliance cheaper for the market, this is something which we at EBRD believe very much in and try to promote. And this is obviously sharing a personal dream of having all compliance requirements digitalized and automated, as a dream of a person who 20 years ago had to run a procurement process in the government, or has been put in front of no objection decisions when you have 20,000 of them every year, and you don't have the information to draw on to make a right decision on behalf of the public sector. And the second part of the answer for why we digitalize and why it's not only a tech fix, but something extremely important, this is perhaps about performance. Because I am a lawyer, so just please excuse me for trying to protect my own, but the value of the regulatory framework is only as big as we can see it happening in the real life practice. And if we are not able to make the compliance easier for the market and more responsive to the digitalized economy we are living in, then our performance in the public sector will be suffering from this. And I see digitalization precisely as a tech fix for that, something that will help us with compliance, with achieving transparency with no cost on the competition and value for money side. And I'm seeing digitalization of procurement as an opportunity to actually have the procurement people focus on performance of procurement more. So this is something I would like, Albert, you to have a deeper look into on your discussion, because there are obvious values in making it to happen. And on this, we also have to answer ourselves a question whether this true potential of tech, it is being limited by the technology that we have, or it's being limited by the regulatory frameworks that we have. And I think that you have made extremely valid point asking about how procurement is being digitalized and whether it is being digitalized the way it serves the market best. Because we are frequently facing the cases where something new coming that has a huge potential to improve transparency, for instance, like data standards. We have OCP here, so I understand that we have all heard about the benefits of using the data standard for any transaction, including procurement. So we have looked at the cases where the governments are suffering in the first place from lack of digitalization guidance on systemic and infrastructure topics like signatures, like cloud, like data governance, like storage, like security. And then we have a problem how to buy the e-procurement system that is actually doing the job for the procurement officer. So I think here you have made a very valid point, and it would be worth exploring in your research to actually understand whether we have moved from the point where we had technology limitations to the point where we have regulatory limitations, or the other way around. Because this core decision you have mentioned, to me personally, came as a shock, because working with the countries as we work with, so they are mainly transition economies emerging from post-Soviet system or undemocratic rule, struggling to have a better market and better life for their people. For them, it is very important to protect the transparency as a core value. And I'm speaking here being Polish, and I believe that one of the best things we have done in Poland in early 90s was to push for transparency to save us from other horrors of procurement regulation and from problems that we would have had if not for very high emphasis on transparency. So this is for consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, those are very good reflections. I think that there's, I guess that there's two main issues. The first is, of course, you digitalize for a purpose, which I think goes without saying, and it's not about, oh, there's this technology, so therefore I need to find a way to implement it just because the technology exists. You need to think about what you're trying to do with the technology, and on that, I'm with you that digitalization, especially where it can facilitate leapfrogging towards higher levels of governance, is very useful. And in that regard, there can be different considerations, but I think that it's contested, and that's one of the things that I was thinking about when preparing this presentation. There's that the governance needs are different in different settings, and that's why we cannot say, well, because the technology is going to work the same everywhere in the world, the solutions have to be the same everywhere in the world, because the governance context is quite important. For example, the issue of transparency, I understand that there's places where maybe more overt corruption problems, or maybe with more interest in from civil society to engage with those processes. I don't think we could take that as a universal. So for example, if we look at what the Court of Justice has been saying, it's not only the Antea Polska, but it's also the Luxembourg beneficial ownership case that came also recently. Those are cases where the Court of Justice questions whether it makes sense for me in the evening to be able to look at that information having any public interest, really, right? So the Court of Justice says it's not been demonstrated that for everyone seeing this information justifies the impingement on other rights. And I think that's where this balancing with the other rights, whether it's commercial rights of companies, whether it's commercial rights of individuals or personal rights of individuals, that's where things get really tricky legally. I would be in general skeptical to say we need to take a bulldozer and say we need to get rid of all of the legal constraints on the use of technologies so that the technology can maximally used. I would agree that we need to look at whether there are necessary constraints or whether some constraints can be modulated. But I think this is a tricky conversation, and of course it's one where I think on the grand scheme of things we're probably splitting hairs, right? So I think we're all on saying, digitalization can of course create advantages in the way procurement is managed. I was just taking a very Western European approach to the research, probably as part of my biases. So I'm going to make sure that I make that clear in the introduction to my book, so that at least I have a small excuse to why I say what I say. The other thing that I think your reflection brings as well is the importance of whether digitalization can be used as a tactic, or so the instrumentalization of digitalization as a change catalyst, and I think that links with something that was in the chat about the other big transition in procurement, which is towards sustainability, right? So the other area where there's a lot of expectation and promise is to say digitalization is going to help us go greener, because the digitalization is going to be fantastic because it's going to give us all this information. It's going to allow us, for example, to implement life cycle costing, take into account very complicated models of CO2 emissions calculations and so on. But it's very hard to do both things at the same time. And there are very simple examples, but there's, for example, all of these scooters, right, that are being sold as zero emissions. So you could say, oh, your company comes to you and says, if you want urban mobility with zero emission, you need to use these scooters. And they don't explain that somebody drives at night with a very polluting big truck collecting them to bring them to charge somewhere, and whether the energy that they use to charge them is not renewable, right? So I think that, again, because of the research, I need to silo it a bit and look at it. But if you take the bigger look, that there's lots of issues that complicate the analysis and make it even more difficult, because lots of the things that we were doing trying to digitize is trying to push for stronger institutional capability, more sustainability, more equality, less economic disparity, progress, and that's adding sort of one additional layer of regulatory complication to the already very competing interest in procurement. So I find it fascinating, but I can see how it can be frustrating or even questionable from a more pragmatic point of view.
Liza, I didn't know if you had follow-up or if we want to start turning to some of the questions that we have in the Q&A. Did you have any follow-up from that, or Shope?
No, nothing from me. Let's go to the Q&A.
Okay. The first question, Albert, that came in for you relates to the fact that that the type of information, better quality data, could be a rich source of big and open data to identify opportunities for public service improvement, integrity weaknesses, outcomes that are having positive or negative impact on communities. Are you seeing any good work being done in this area? You're on mute.
I'm muted, sorry. So that is, in terms of good work, in theory, yes, there is a very interesting, I don't know if it's a toolkit or something called like that by the Open Contracting Partnership on how to use data for sustainability and other purposes. I think it's from like mid last year. So it's theoretically very interesting in looking at what you could do if you had the data, but I haven't seen much of that happening on the ground. So I think there's still a very big challenges in developing that in detail. There are narrow applications. So for example, there is something that's generally seen as best practice is the Paraguay Red Flags Project against corruption coming on the back of the pandemic. But they're quite narrow. So what I haven't seen is the use of that data for improvement, sort of for category management or things like that. But I presume some of that is happening behind the scenes. So again, if an organization is doing that internally, say a central purchasing body, or I don't know, maybe somebody at the EBRD are looking at those things and how to streamline expenditure and so on, that's not the sort of thing that's going to be put out there for everyone to see. So I cannot point at any specific experiences, but I don't know if maybe Eliza has some more sort of field information.
Thank you so much, Albert. So indeed, what we are trying to do at the bank, and I'm very happy that you have touched upon the question, who is taking the risk of digitalization of procurement? Because this is precisely where EBRD tries to contribute, because we are, being an international organization and investor, we are sort of able to take some of the risk from introducing new ideas to the market and to the countries as a part of our mandate to improve the economic development and promote digital economy as such. And this is something that we try to do in practice and frequently working with partners. So you will be surprised to see how much can be actually achieved at the meeting point between new environmental and climate change standards, approach to structured data, and getting procurement authority in the government committed to strategic use of procurement as a tool to promote sustainability. And very simple example, I'm working on a pilot project, which is called Bulb Project, and is essentially about how government is buying lighting. bulb project, because we have 27 type of bulbs, which have eco labels. They are normally horribly more expensive than standard product. And if you would try to buy them through the typical procurement, most probably you would never try to understand why they are valuable. And if you do this green catalog, as we call it in the internal lingo, on the municipality level, you are perhaps proving to yourself that you can improve the quality of life in the city, you can save them money, but you can also have the energy efficiency impact on reducing the emission gas to a certain extent. But imagine that you are working on the same pilot in a country. So we are moving from the level of annual budget of municipality of 100 people to 40,000 or 140,000 municipalities in the country, which are buying the same bulbs. And if we are able through procurement to prove that this is actually more cost efficient financially and economically, better for the environment, and giving us a reduction in emission gases, this is a selling point that speaks to everyone. But without having an approach, having the methodology, having a digital tool, and making it easy to use, and finally making upfront measurable to everyone who buys a single bulb, you can't achieve that. So I'm super excited about bulb project, no matter that the pilot country is Ukraine, and today we cannot show you the real example how it works because they have a problem of making electricity work, not to save on it. But this has showed us the potential how you design a pilot of green procurement that serves municipal level, and then you scale it up across the country. And you see what is the massive impact behind a simple thing like bulb. Okay, 27 types of them.
Okay, let's turn to the next question. I like the bulb project. This is for Albert, do you foresee a way to discourage low quality mass chatbot or large language model produced bids on public tenders? The concern is kind of abuse of the system and the use of potential terms of service. How do you see this potentially being addressed?
So I think it's difficult, and this is one where universities are now having to think about this as well, because these sorts of things also apply to writing essays and producing any sorts of issues. I think what you probably need to do is create your requirements in a way that is not easy to just answer, right? So everything that is fact finding should be separated, and then you should have a part of the tender that is purely analytical or applied, which is where the technology doesn't get, because they cannot find other examples, they cannot simply replicate it. So it's trying to find something like these CAPTCHAs, but for text, right? So and of course some humans are going to fail. So the other thing that we need to think about is that sometimes I think things I'm a robot and I need to switch off my computer and start again. But something like that. So try to create links between bits of information that are non-obvious, and that require some deeper understanding of how you're answering to the specific requirement, and assess that first, so that everything else that is information based can come later. But probably this still requires a lot more thinking. I don't know if anybody else has any ideas.
I was like, as you were about to say it, I was thinking, or just pepper it with a bunch of CAPTCHA, which I don't know anybody else who hates them as probably as much as me. There's got to be a better way, folks. Let's talk about the next question. And I didn't know if this is kind of Eliza wants to respond to. So there's a question on post-procurement data. How could we ensure a harmonic reporting of procurement spending data from decentralized institutions for AI/ML to work properly in the interests of public good? I don't know if Eliza or Albert want to take turns responding.
Well, let Albert be critical, and then I will try to be optimistic. Albert.
I think you should start with the optimism, and I'll just see if I have to disagree with anything or not.
Okay. Well, I think that this question is very much to the point of of the real issues which are behind digitalization. Because I am, of course, jokes aside, I totally understand that there is a marketing hype created by the IT vendors around various products. But when you as a public buyer go through this beautiful PR message, you are down to the question when I will benefit from this solution and what I need to have to benefit from this solution. And most frequently, the answer is data. So my favorite quotation from Michali Fazekas, who was doing the DigiWist, was rubbish in, rubbish out. And this is precisely how it is when it comes to what we consider as a data problem, data access problem, and data collection problem in procurement. Unfortunately, for a very long time, we didn't have a global procurement-specific data standard that would be recognized by the industry. We have had plenty of standards that were imposed by various political organizations, and they never taken off because they were difficult to use. So I am extremely grateful to World Bank and Open Contracting Partnership that they have come up with OCDS standard based on JSON, because when I'm working with digital vendors, everyone knows JSON. Nothing special, easy to absorb, understandable, beautiful progress on this. So coming back to data, the problem of the data is that it has to be standardized, it has to be machine readable, and it has to be accessible. So for ourselves, in our work, and this is a hint towards regulatory needs, Albert, we had to redefine what we understand today under principles of open government data. Because for us, open government data is not the data that you give to the civil society to play with. Open government data is the data that is being exchanged between departments to serve the business, to serve the citizens. And you know that until today, there is no legally binding definition of government data or open government data. We use what so-called industry standards. So we have open government data chapter, and it is still valid. And these 8 points of what qualities of data make it a quality data, they are still valid, but they need a redefinition every time we are benefiting from technological progress. So 20 years ago, sharing the data timely with other users was meant by, oh, I will publish it once per year. Today, it's real time. And making the data accessible online 20 years ago was a dream because of the cost. This cost disappeared today. And finally, making this data non-proprietary and accessible to business, to citizens, and to the government from the same source, this is something that became possible only presently. So at the very bottom of while it is so difficult to digitalize procurement, it is the question what we digitalize and how. Because if we start from data, then we are building up the capacities to do more and to do better. I know it's from Mozilla, but it's my favorite slogan on how digitalization can help. So to do more and to do better, we actually need more and better data overall. So data standardization, data governance models, and data models that are serving every jurisdiction, every type of procurement policy, this is a must. And that's why at EBRD, we are making a pretty heavy investment into development of the data standard for procurement to make sure that we know how to build digital systems and how to make different digital systems speaks to each other. Because today the reality is that we are talking about interoperability of data, not interoperability of the systems. So I think this is optimist speaking, but Albert, you are welcome to criticize.
No, I'm with you fully on this one. So that's why I wanted you to go first. Just because the question raised how to do it sort of in the UK context, I think that because we are in the process of getting the new procurement bill, and one of these supporting investments is supposed to be this digital platform that is mainly about data. What I think is that we need a much more aggressive approach to designing and embedding those requirements in the system, So in the UK, that there's usually a difficult regulatory issue, that is that most of the rules apply to the central government, but then everything that is sort of the wider public sector and everything that is local usually cannot be directly subjected to the same rules. I think we need to find a way of moving beyond that. We need a system-wide data system, because otherwise it's going to be problematic. The Cabinet Office published a paper on the transparency ambitions that they have that sounds encouraging, but maybe not quite there yet. Gavin Heyman has a Twitter thread that I'm sure people can find on where it falls short. So I don't know who asked, because it was anonymously, but I think what I would say is, in the specific context of the UK, if you were to try to influence this change, what you want to do is get on the ear of the Crown Commercial Service and try to be as ambitious as possible in embedding the principles that Eliza was talking about in this specific secondary legislation that is going to create the platform.
The next question that comes in is one I'm also happy to answer, deals with the initiative to have, basically, it sounds like a global alert system that could inform countries, banks, a multitude of buyers of problematic or risky vendors. Is there any single international code? No. Dumpster fire is a words that come to mind when I think of the way that things like this are handled. The closest we've seen to a harmonization is maybe the cross-debarment list associated with the banks. You do not see it internationally. My good friend and colleague Colin Swan over at the World Bank has attempted to kind of catalog world debarment systems with his colleagues over at the World Bank, but even that demonstrates very clearly how there is a lack of a uniform standard in how countries handle debarment. There's a lack of uniform standard on how countries handle the list of excluded entities. The standards aren't the same. The amount of information provided about why there's exclusion isn't the same. It's really a hodgepodge of information all over the place. And, you know, you can find names, like the United States will give you kind of a name, but with a template language about why the company is excluded, which is basically no information at all. Many countries don't even regularly update or use their own systems. I think Canada's had the same three systems or three companies for years. It doesn't list individuals. So this is my long-winded way of saying it is a mess. It is all over the place. There's no uniform standard, and each government is basically left to deal with this on their own. Shope.
Yeah, so I'll just jump in and say, first, it has to depend on what you define as a problematic contractor. So the only way that procurement systems deal with such people is through the debarment or exclusion systems, and that is generally for a very specific list of offenses. And to have such a list, it means that whatever offenses or allegations against the vendor have been properly investigated, and there's evidence to say, okay, we now say you're problematic, you go on this list. So countries do that either through, some administrative procedure, which must meet the requirements of due process, or through a judicial process. So you can be convicted for specific offenders, and then that conviction is enough to put you on this list. But that list is for debarment. It's limited in time, in countries limited in scope. So sometimes it's not national, sometimes it's regional, or it's only limited to a particular contracting authority. So it will be very, very difficult to have a list that is global in nature. It will be impossible. The banks can do it because they have very similar procurement systems, and they've harmonized their anti-corruption framework in terms of their funded procurements. There was an attempt to have a kind of harmonized list in the East African community, so between Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. But after the announcement, I don't think they ever actually put in the infrastructure to make this happen. So it's a nice idea on paper, but it's actually impossible, I would say, and maybe not even desirable, to be honest, given where different countries are at, and different legal systems and different standards for investigations, et cetera, et cetera.
The one thing I would add is that and we were talking about this in preparation for today's session. I appreciate Albert's discussion about basically keeping the concept in many instances of kind of technology and transparency separate, because I think that we can want to advance the use of technology to improve the procurement process, but we don't always want to share that information publicly. And I also think that the idea of continuing to push them together can often dissuade people that may be more receptive to the use of technology, might cause them to shy away. The one thing I think that Shopé is hitting on, which I agree with, is you're right. There's so many different standards and different systems. It's definitely not desirable. And I agree with you to even think about a harmonization, but this is one of those areas where I know industry is going to disagree with me, where I think more transparency would be better, even if we're not using the same standards or the same system or a universal system, which I don't think is necessarily what we're talking about. The idea of governments getting to a point where they could be more transparent about how they define a problematic contractor or the basis for it, and then providing that information so that this can be part of a more effective due diligence process, not only for governments, but also for private sector suppliers that use the review of these lists as part of their own kind of supply chain management, risk management, due diligence compliance processes. So I think that that's where there could be greater improvement, even if we don't see necessarily which I agree with Shopé, a harmonization of kind of this universal standard. Albert.
Yeah, just to say, I mean, I put in the chat, but that's one where technology is not going to help, because there's this paper on, let's create a blockchain infrastructure so that debarment information in particular can be exchanged on the blockchain. Well, if we don't know what information needs to be put there and exactly how it's going to feature there, the cross-border issues from a due process perspective and so on, then technology, it's not going to help you, because it's primarily a governance problem, and then technology becomes the medium to deliver it, right? So yeah, just to raise that point, that blockchain is not going to allow us to know who's a problematic vendor. First we have to define who is, and then we decide how we exchange the information.
Okay, so let's see if we can get a few more questions. My colleague, Josh Schwartz, asks, I wonder if an unforeseen value of the attempt to automate is to confront the procurement authority with the unacknowledged fuzzy elements in its own procurement process and desiderata. On the other hand, I wonder if the attempt to automate may have the undesirable effect of inappropriately eliminating such fuzzy considerations from the decision calculus. And Eliza, I think you want to respond to that?
Yes, precisely. Thank you so much, because this is what I wanted to bring to this discussion, because I think this is making a last square of all these round topics we have taken, starting from transparency through making it work, finally to capacities and enabling it to happen in practice. So coming back to the strictly legal question, it is our procurement laws. Are they drafted and are they designed for digital processes? And this is something that we normally have to face upfront at the beginning of any digitalization project for any area, but in procurement in particular, because we have legal instruments and procurement growing organically with the markets over the good number of years. And no one is asking themselves a question on behalf of the government in the country X, is my procurement law drafted and building the practice the way that is easy to digitalize? And most frequently it is not. So on one side, we understand that the clarity of the regulation is one problem, and the scope for discretion is another problem. I am coming from the civil law country, so for us, clara non sunt interpretanda is very important. So you have to draft the law to make it understandable and very clear and very specific. But this is not the global standard. In other countries, more generic approach and more generalization is recommended in the legal framework, precisely to cater for individual cases and the discretion to be applied as appropriate. However, in procurement, we, I think, have already completed a debate where discretion is useful, where discretion is not useful. So my personal experience is that first step of the digitalization project, which is typically asking the government how your procurement process works, what you do when, and which information you have to collect from each step of procurement process, is actually helping us to clarify whether we have this fuzzy area, or we have intended discretion, or we have lack of regulation in terms of regulatory gap that has to be managed by the government. And I think that this is an extremely good outcome of any digitalization project that helps lawyers to look at how the rules transform into tools for making these rules to happen without opening a legal act. And this is something that actually does help us all when we have an understanding that, yes, we are living in the world which will be legislating differently, because we are all gonna have first contact with the law, not through the official journal published by the parliament. Our first contact with the law will be here. What I have to do as a citizen to get my driving license, abstracting from procurement problems. So we have to understand that our personal attitudes are much more flexible, and we are much better prepared to have what my colleagues sometimes say, yeah, you want to have legislation to be simplified. No, I want the legislation to be clear, because if it's clear and logical, computer will take it. When it's neither clear nor logical, then we have a problem.
Albert, we are down to our final minute and a half. I don't know if you have anything else you want to say before we release everybody to the rest of their day.
Thank you to you all for your contributions, and to everyone for the questions, and for bearing with us for these 90 minutes. I found it very, very useful. And I'll be circulating some further thoughts through the blog, and there's going to be more materials through the GW page. So nothing else from me other than thank you.
Well, I will thank everybody for joining us today. And thank you to Albert for the wonderful presentation, and everyone for the great questions and the discussion. The one point I want to note is that following this, within the next 48 hours, you will get an email from Zoom with a link to the program page, which will have the recording and a copy of the slides. And we were hoping to also update it with additional resources that were discussed today, and even some that were not discussed today. So stay tuned for that link. The only other thing I will say is please save that email if you need any proof of attendance. That Zoom email is your proof of attendance. We don't provide certifications independently from that. So hang on to that email and give it to whoever you need to give to. So with that, again, I thank everybody for their time today. Thank you again to my fellow speakers, and have a wonderful day. Take care.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.